My name is Paula, and I am going to read a couple of stories for you today. They are about clever pets. I think you're going to enjoy them. The first one I'm going to read is called The Great Gracie Chase, Stop That Dog, written by Cynthia Ryland and illustrated by Mark Teague. Now, Cynthia Ryland is one of these authors where when you see her, you know her books are going to be great. This is a great book, and I am reading this with permission from Scholastic Publishers. So, The Great Gracie Chase. Once there was a little round dog named Gracie Rose. She was a very good dog. She helped the bigger dog watch the house. She kept the kitty company. She even sang to the fish when it was lonely. You see, Gracie loved a quiet house. She loved the kitty sleeping on the windowsill, the big dog sleeping on the couch, the quiet fish going ploop, ploop. For Gracie, a quiet home was the best home. Gracie Rose was good every single day of her life except one, the day the painters came. Gracie did not like the painters, but she did not know this until the day they came to her house. So when they arrived one day to paint Gracie's kitchen, she did not like it. Here they came in their big, noisy truck. You can tell that it's a big, noisy truck. There they were at the door with their clanging ladders and big person voices. There they were, dragging chairs across Gracie's quiet kitchen floor. Gracie Rose watched them with her ears straight up in the air. She barked and told them to go outside. But do you know what? Gracie was put outside. Look at that face. You can tell. She's like, what's happening? And she did not like it one bit. So Gracie, that silly little dog who loved a quiet house, decided to do something naughty. Gracie decided to take a walk all by herself. Someone had left the gate open, probably a busy painter. Gracie was supposed to be a good dog and never go through the gate by herself, but she did. And when she was halfway down the street, she heard someone say loudly, "Where's Gracie?" And that began the Great Gracie Chase. Because when the people in the house came outside to find her, and the painters came outside, and the neighbors came outside, and the garbage man stepped out of his truck, and the paperboy stopped his bike, and the delivery woman pulled over, and everyone said, "There's Gracie!" Gracie began to run. Gracie did not know why she was running, except that suddenly everybody in the world was trying to catch her, and she did not want to be caught. So Gracie ran down the street, and everybody else ran down the street. Gracie ran up the hill, and everybody else ran up the hill. Gracie ran across the schoolyard, and everybody else ran across the schoolyard. Gracie ran through the water fountain, and everyone else ran through the water fountain. Well, except the cat, who didn't like the water fountain. The chase got bigger. "Stop that dog!" everybody cried, which only made Gracie run faster. And soon the whole town was watching or running in the Great Gracie Chase. Poor little Gracie. She did not like this walk all by herself. It was too quick and too noisy, and all she wanted was to be beside her fish again. But she couldn't stop running now. Everybody wanted to catch her. So she ran and ran and ran until pretty soon the painters had to stop because they couldn't catch their breath. And the delivery woman had to stop because her feet hurt. And the paperboy had to stop because his bike broke. And someone else had to stop because she tripped and fell. And one by one, the people had to stop because they could not keep up with Gracie. Then suddenly, Gracie realized how quiet everything was again. She looked behind her, and the whole world was quiet. People were resting. How nice, Gracie Gracie thought. So that silly little dog turned around and walked back home, all by herself. The painters did not return to Gracie's house that day. They had to go take naps. And once again, Gracie had a quiet home. She was happy, that silly little dog. The end. Very nice book. She's very smart, isn't she? She got her own way. So the next book I want to read to you is called Mrs. Crump's Cat. So this is about a cat by Linda Smith, and the illustrations are done by David Roberts. And this, I am reading this book with permission from Harper-Collins Children's Books. Mrs. Crump's Cat. One rainy day, Mrs. Crump opened her front door to fetch the paper and discovered an exquisite golden cat shivering on her porch step. "Shoo," she said. "Shoo, go away." But the cat did not go away. "I'll have you know," Mrs. Crump said, "I have no use for a cat." Mrs. Crump turned away, but somehow the door did not quite shut, and the cat slipped in. "I should have known," Mrs. Crump said. "Cats are sneaky by nature." She wrestled a log into place, then watched as the cat preened and primped and polished itself in front of the fire. When the cat is dry, Mrs. Crump thought, I'll send it on its way. But when the cat was dry, it curled itself around Mrs. Crump's ankles like a soft velvet ribbon and mewed hungrily. Mrs. Crump went to her pantry and got a slice of bread, but the cat would not go near it. Just as I suspected, Mrs. Crump said. Cats are finicky as well. Mrs. Crump decided she would have to go to town, and she threw on her overcoat. Tonight, she said to the cat, I'll send you on your way. Mr. Henry nodded his head and said, Good day, when Mrs. Crump entered his store. Good day to you, she said curtly, and was a bit surprised that she had said even that. Mrs. Crump paid for a pint of cream and had started on her way when she changed her mind. What is it? Something else? The grocer asked. And before she even thought the words, Mrs. Crump found herself asking that a shiny red pet dish be added to her order. Do you have a new dog? Mr. Henry asked. I do not, Mrs. Crump said. I have a stray cat. Don't feed it, Mr. Henry said. If you do, you'll never be rid of it. It was the strangest thing, Mrs. Crump thought, but somehow the way back home seemed far shorter than the way there. That night, Mrs. Crump filled the shiny red dish with cream and added another log to the fire. Soon the bowl was empty and the cat was full. It was time to put the cat out. Mrs. Crump stood at the door with the cat in her arms. She looked up at the clear, starry sky. She poked her nose out and sniffed the cool, dry air. Mrs. Crump looked down at the cat. The cat looked up and purred magnificently. I smell rain, Mrs. Crump decided, slamming the door shut. It would be foolish to turn out a dry cat, only to have a wet one on the porch step again come morning. Tomorrow, she said to the cat, I will send you on your way. The next day was bright and sunny, and Mrs. Crump was a bit disappointed. It was a lovely day to turn the cat out, but it seemed such a shame to waste half a pint of cream when she had traveled so far to buy it. It will only spoil, Mrs. Crump decided. When the cream is gone, I'll send the cat on its way. Mrs. Crump poured the last of the cream at breakfast. The cat stretched and yawned and circled the bowl, then stopped and scratched. Mrs. Crump parted a bit of its golden fur and saw, to her horror, a single flea flitting between the cat's ears. I will not have critters of that sort in my house, Mrs. Crump declared. Before you go anywhere, she said to the cat, you'll need a good scrubbing with brown soap. A lot of trouble you are, Mrs. Crump said, throwing on her overcoat. She pulled the door shut behind her and headed for town. "Hello again," Mr. Henry said as Mrs. Crump entered the store. "And hello again to you," she said, but not quite as curtly as before. Mrs. Crump paid for her bar of brown soap and a pint of cream and had started on her way when she changed her mind. "What is it? Something else?" the grocer asked. And before she even thought the words, Mrs. Crump found herself asking that a dainty yellow collar with a silver bell be added to the order. "I take it you still have the cat," Mr. Henry said. "I would have turned the cat out long ago," Mrs. Crump explained, "but it's been one thing after another, and now I'm afraid the cat has forgotten its way." "Hang a sign on my store," Mr. Henry suggested. "If someone claims the cat, your troubles are over." "And if no one claims the cat?" Mrs. Crump asked. "I'm afraid you'll have no choice but to keep it," Mr. Henry said. It was the strangest thing, but somehow Mrs. Crump had never noticed how smart a man Mr. Henry was. That evening, after the cat's bath, Mrs. Crump made up a sign, a very small sign. She started to write, "Found. One exquisite golden cat. Inquire within." But she changed her mind. She turned the paper over and thought a bit. "I did not find you," she said to the cat. "You were on my porch step after all." She wrote the word "found" in very small letters. "You've been sneaky and finicky and plenty of trouble," Mrs. Crump reminded the cat. "And you were not really very exquisite when you found me," Mrs. Crump decided. "You were wet." Mrs. Crump wrote the word "wet" in very large letters. "I could hardly have called you golden," Mrs. Crump said. "You look plain yellow to me." Mrs. Crump wrote "yellow" next to the word "wet." "And to be fair," Mrs. Crump thought, "I mustn't forget about the fleas." Finally, she set the sign down and stood back to admire her work. It read, "Found. One sneaky, finicky, troublesome, wet yellow cat with fleas." Mrs. Crump was at Mr. Henry's store first thing in the morning. She pinned the sign to a dusty corner, and Mr. Henry promised to let her know the minute someone inquired about the cat. The very next evening, in fact, Mrs. Crump was back at Mr. Henry's store. "Sorry," Mr. Henry said. "No one asked about the cat today." "A pity," Mrs. Crump said, paying for 6 fat livers and a can of tuna. Mrs. Crump found herself singing on the way home. Finally, at the end of the week, Mr. Henry showed up at Mrs. Crump's door with the dusty sign in his hands. No one had claimed the sneaky, finicky, troublesome, wet yellow cat with fleas. It was the strangest thing, but somehow Mrs. Crump was not the least bit surprised. "It's just as well," Mr. Henry said. "You have bought a collar, soap, livers, tuna, 2 full pints of cream, and a shiny red dish. You may as well have a cat to go with them." Now, how could this happen? Mrs. Crump wondered. "I had no use for a cat." "Cats are clever that way," Mr. Henry said. "Before you know it, you'll be sitting by the fire with the cat on your lap, wondering how you ever got along without it." That night, Mrs. Crump put an extra log on the fire and did just that. The end. So there's that clever cat. How did that happen? We know how it happened, don't we? So thank you for listening to my stories. Goodbye.